The morning it all began was deceptively peaceful. The kind of crisp Saturday where the sun filters through the blinds in golden ribbons and the smell of fresh coffee fills the air, promising a slow start to the weekend at least until the knock came. It wasn't a polite tap, but a sharp, rapid-fire pounding that made both my wife, Emily, and me exchange the kind of glance you give when you know trouble has just found your doorstep. And sure enough, standing on our porch was none other than our neighborhood's self-appointed ruler, Karen Whitfield, HOA board president. Clipboard in hand, lips pursed like she had bitten into a lemon, and eyes scanning my wife from head to toe as if she were a shoplifter caught in the act. "We need to talk," she announced without preamble, her voice laced with the kind of authority only people who've never actually had authority try to wield, and before I could invite her in, or more accurately, block her from entering, she stepped forward just enough to let us know this wasn't a social visit. Emily, still in the navy blue jacket she wore for work the night before, stood calmly, her posture straight, her hair tied back neatly, giving Karen nothing to latch onto except the small gold badge-shaped pin that sat on her lapel. And that's when Karen's eyes narrowed like a hawk spotting prey, her tone shifting to a theatrical gasp. "Oh my God. Are you pretending to be a police officer? Do you know that's a federal crime?" she demanded, already pulling out her phone like she was about to call 911 on the spot, which would have been ironic if she had any idea who she was dealing with. I raised a hand, trying to cut off the absurdity before it spiraled, but Emily, to her credit, didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't even raise her voice. She just said, in that calm, measured tone she's perfected over years of fieldwork, "I'm not pretending to be anything," but Karen, convinced she'd just uncovered the crime of the century, was already scrolling through her phone with a smirk telling us, "This is going straight to the HOA security committee and the county sheriff impersonating an officer gets you jail time," as if she had just personally saved the neighborhood from a dangerous criminal. I was tempted to laugh, but I knew better, because people like Karen don't back down when they think they're right, they double down. And sure enough, she started snapping pictures of Emily, the jacket, the badge, even our front porch as though she was gathering evidence for trial. It would have been comical if not for the fact that Emily's real job wasn't just law enforcement, it was federal law enforcement, the kind of position where even her name isn't listed in certain directories for security reasons, and though she couldn't openly flash her credentials without a need-to-know basis, I could see the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth, the kind she gets when she's deciding whether to let someone dig their own hole or shut them down immediately. But before Emily could say another word, Karen was already storming off, yelling over her shoulder about fake cops and federal charges like she was the star witness in a courtroom drama, leaving us with a porch full of awkward silence and the faint sound of her heels clacking down the driveway. Emily finally turned to me, sighed, and said, "Well, this should be fun," in that dry, understated way that meant it was about to be anything but fun. Because if Karen was truly going to call in the cavalry, she'd soon find out the hard way that she had just picked a fight with someone who didn't just know the law, she was the law. In a capacity Karen couldn't even begin to comprehend, and as much as I hated HOA drama, I had to admit, I was curious to see how this one would play out. By late afternoon, the situation had already snowballed in true HOA Karen fashion. I was out in the garage sorting through a box of old camping gear when I heard the unmistakable wail of a siren, low and brief, followed by the sound of a vehicle pulling into our driveway with the slow, deliberate crunch of tires on gravel. And when I stepped outside, there it was, a county sheriff's SUV, lights off now, but still giving off that aura of official presence, and stepping out of the driver's seat was Deputy Markson, a stocky guy with the patient but tired expression of someone who's been dealing with nonsense calls all day, and in the passenger seat, leaning halfway out before the vehicle even fully stopped, was Karen, face flushed with self-importance, gesturing toward our house as if she had just led them to a fugitive's hideout. "That's her," Karen announced loudly enough for the whole street to hear, pointing directly at Emily, who had just stepped out onto the porch with a mug of tea in hand like she'd been expecting this little performance. And Markson gave me a small nod before addressing her in that careful, procedural voice officers use when they don't yet know if a conversation is about to turn hostile. "Ma'am, I just need to ask you a few questions about a report we received," and Emily, utterly unbothered, motioned for him to go ahead. Setting her tea down on the porch railing, but before he could continue, Karen jumped in, waving her phone around as though it were Exhibit A. "She's been walking around with a fake badge, pretending to be a police officer, probably to intimidate the neighbors or something. I've got pictures." And she thrust the phone toward him with the triumphant energy of someone expecting applause, but Markson didn't seem nearly as impressed as she hoped. He glanced at the screen briefly, then looked back at Emily, his tone still professional, but with a trace of skepticism. "Ma'am, can you explain the badge you were wearing earlier today?" And that was the moment I saw Emily decide she'd had enough of the charade, because without so much as a sigh, she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket, pulled out her credentials, and in one smooth motion flipped open the leather holder to reveal the gleaming gold shield and embossed ID card of a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the kind of thing that instantly changes the air in a conversation. Markson's eyes widened just slightly, and he straightened his posture almost imperceptibly because he knew exactly what that meant. But Karen, she froze for a half second before scoffing. "That could be fake too. You can buy those online," which might have been the most catastrophically bad thing she could have said in that moment, because Emily's voice dropped into that low, controlled register she used in interrogations, the one that made even me straighten my back, and she said, "Ma'am, impersonating a federal agent is a felony. Accusing a federal agent of impersonating is obstruction if done knowingly. Which one do you want to claim you're doing right now?" And the color drained from Karen's face so quickly it was almost impressive, but in true Karen fashion, she tried to backpedal without admitting fault, stammering something about just being concerned for neighborhood safety and wanting to make sure no one was breaking the law, though her voice had lost all its earlier confidence. Markson, for his part, gave a short nod toward Emily, saying, "Understood, Agent. Sorry for the inconvenience," before turning to Karen with the kind of measured politeness officers use when they're about to say something you don't want to hear. "Ma'am, unless you've got evidence of an actual crime, I'd suggest you refrain from making further reports of this nature. False reports tie up emergency resources," and though he didn't raise his voice, the message was clear. Enough to make Karen's lips purse again, though this time in silent frustration. Emily didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't even make eye contact with her. She just picked up her tea again and went back inside, leaving Karen standing there like a balloon with the air let out, and I followed, partly to avoid whatever sputtering excuses she was about to throw out, and partly because I knew Emily well enough to realize she was already thinking 2 steps ahead. Sure enough, the moment the door closed, she said, "That won't be the last we hear from her. People like that don't quit. They escalate." And though I wanted to believe maybe this public humiliation would be enough to shut Karen down, a part of me knew Emily was right, because Karen's kind of stubbornness wasn't fueled by logic, it was fueled by ego. And now that she'd been embarrassed in front of the sheriff, she was going to find some other angle to come at us. And when she did, she'd have no idea that Emily wasn't just prepared for her, she'd be ready to dismantle her entire little HOA empire piece by piece if pushed too far. When the second week of fallout began, the AOO was still reeling from the shock of learning that my wife, Claire, wasn't just some suburban resident in yoga pants, but an actual federal agent whose jurisdiction extended far beyond anything they could dream of controlling. Yet, instead of retreating and licking their wounds, Karen doubled down in a way that almost made me admire her determination if it hadn't been so pathetically self-destructive, because she somehow convinced herself and several gullible board members that Claire's badge had to be fake, and the federal presence in our neighborhood was part of some elaborate scheme to intimidate the HOA into compliance with my so-called vendetta against them. So naturally she called a special investigation meeting at the clubhouse, invited the board, a few of her inner circle gossip friends, and even an HOA attorney, declaring in her email that the safety of our neighborhood depends on exposing this fraud, which was a spectacularly bad idea because unbeknownst to her, That very same attorney had previously represented Claire's agency in a separate federal case, meaning he knew instantly that Karen was digging herself into a hole. So deep she'd eventually need mining equipment to get out? Nonetheless, I attended the meeting for one reason. I knew Claire was going to walk in halfway through and drop the kind of bombshell that would leave everyone too stunned to even remember how to blink, and when I got there, I could already sense the tension brewing as Karen launched into a PowerPoint presentation complete with grainy screenshots of Claire getting out of her government SUV, pausing to show off her fake badge, and walking into a building downtown while narrating with all the righteous fury of someone who truly thought she was blowing the lid off a national conspiracy, except her evidence amounted to the fact that Claire didn't look like a federal agent and sometimes wore sneakers instead of heels. I swear, by slide 6, I was debating whether to burst out laughing or record it for Claire's amusement later, but before I could decide, the door swung open and in came Claire herself, not in civilian clothes this time, but in full official attire, tactical navy field jacket, badge clipped prominently, sidearm holstered at her hip, and a crisp folder of documents in her hand, followed by 2 other agents who looked like they could bench press Karen's entire Honda Civic, and, the room went dead silent except for the faint hum of the projector still showing a freeze frame of Claire's face mid-blink. Claire didn't speak right away. Instead, she calmly walked up to the head of the table, closed Karen's laptop with one finger, and set the folder down, looking directly at Karen as she said in the kind of even deadly serious tone that makes grown men reconsider their life choices. You have exactly 30 seconds to explain why you've been running a public defamation campaign against a federal officer, and you might want to remember that lying to federal agents is a felony. Karen's mouth opened, closed, and opened again like a goldfish that had just seen a shark. But before she could stammer out anything coherent, the HOA attorney, sweating visibly, now cleared his throat and advised her to stop speaking altogether, which only made Claire raise an eyebrow and flip open her folder to reveal a printed transcript of Karen's online posts, emails, and recorded voicemails in which she repeatedly called Claire a fraud, a dangerous imposter, and my fake cop wife, each one time-stamped and legally admissible. Then Claire dropped the real hammer. We have already forwarded this to the U.S. Attorney's Office for review, and while they decide how they want to proceed, I'll be advising our legal division to file for a restraining order against you, your board, and anyone acting on your behalf who interferes with me or my work, which sent a visible shudder through the room because suddenly every person there realized this wasn't neighborhood drama anymore. This was a federal matter with real consequences. Karen tried to muster some indignation, muttering about free speech and her right to protect the community, but Claire cut her off with, "You have the right to remain silent. Perhaps you should start exercising it," before turning to the attorney and calmly asking if the HOA planned to continue pursuing false claims against her or if they prefer to settle the matter quietly. The man all but tripped over his words, insisting there would be no further action from the board, though I could tell from Karen's twitching jaw that she wasn't giving up entirely. And sure enough, the next day she posted a vague safety warning on the HOA's Facebook page about suspicious law enforcement activity in the neighborhood, which lasted all of 3 hours before Claire's agency filed a formal takedown request through the platform's legal compliance team, leaving Karen with yet another paper trail of her own poor decisions. Over the next week, we started noticing a shift. Neighbors who had previously sided with Karen now kept their distance, whispering nervously whenever Claire walked by in her official SUV. The board began canceling non-essential meetings, and even the landscaper started showing up less frequently, as if afraid to get caught in whatever federal net Karen might be tangled in. But Karen herself, predictably, didn't seem capable of admitting defeat, instead resorting to petty tactics like trying to accidentally block our driveway with her SUV, sending passive-aggressive violation notices for imaginary infractions, like flagpole angle exceeding HOA guidelines, and once even having the gall to approach Claire in the grocery store to say, "This isn't over," to which Claire simply replied, "For you, it might be sooner than you think," and walked away without another word. Behind the scenes, I knew Claire was preparing something much bigger, something that went beyond restraining orders and takedown notices, because every evening I'd catch her making quiet phone calls to colleagues in different departments, pulling public records and reviewing case files that had nothing to do with her day-to-day assignments. And when I finally asked if she was going to tell me what she was working on, she just gave me that little half smile and said, "Patience, you're going to enjoy this," which told me that Karen's reign of petty tyranny was about to meet a very official, very public end, and by the way Claire's eyes gleamed, I suspected it would be the kind of ending that would echo through the HOA long after Karen was gone. The courtroom was packed that morning, a strange mix of HOA board members, smugly confident in their own sense of righteousness, and curious townsfolk who had heard rumors about the infamous HOA Karen and her latest stunt, not to mention her impending comeuppance. Sunlight streamed in through tall windows, casting sharp beams across the polished wood floors, but the air inside was thick with tension, and I could feel every set of eyes flicking between me, my wife, and the woman who had started this whole mess. A woman who had strutted into our neighborhood like she owned it, weaponized complaints, false police calls, and her own brand of entitled arrogance until she finally crossed the one line she should have never touched, accusing my wife of impersonating a federal officer when, in reality, my wife was a federal officer with a spotless service record, a reputation for taking down some very dangerous criminals, and an unshakable confidence that made even seasoned cops stand straighter. The gavel came down. Judge Palmer, a man I knew from years back when I handled a land rights case in the county, called the room to order. And right from the first minute you could tell he was in no mood for Karen's games, especially after my attorney slid a thick file across the bench, marked in bold red as Evidence Federal Clearance, which contained not only my wife's active credentials but also the incident report from the night Karen had called 911 screaming about a supposed fake badge. The full dispatch transcript, and most damningly, body cam footage from the responding officers showing my wife calmly presenting her real federal badge, explaining her jurisdiction, and offering to have the department confirm her identity. In real time, something Karen had refused to hear because she was too busy shouting over everyone. As the footage played on the courtroom's large screen, a hush fell over the spectators, and I caught several board members shifting uncomfortably, realizing that their golden-voiced ringleader had not just been wrong, but had made them look like fools for backing her, Karen herself, sitting at the defense table with her overpriced lawyer, turned an alarming shade of crimson, her lips twitching as she tried to whisper frantic objections, but the judge overruled each one with growing impatience. What really sealed her fate, though, was the next clip my lawyer queued up, my home security camera footage, synchronized with the 911 call, showing Karen pacing on our driveway, phone in hand, deliberately misrepresenting what she was seeing, claiming my wife flashed a fake ID and threatened neighbors, even though the video clearly showed my wife speaking in a calm, even tone to two elderly residents who had come over to ask about a noise complaint, both of whom later submitted written statements saying my wife had been respectful, professional, and had diffused a tense situation. The judge leaned back in his chair after that, steepled his fingers, and looked directly at Karen with the kind of expression that told everyone in the room he was about to drop the hammer. But first he allowed my wife to take the stand, where she laid out, in meticulous detail, her career, her current clearance level, her active investigations, and the exact statutes Karen had violated by making a knowingly false report to law enforcement about a federal officer, which, as she reminded the court, was not only slander, but a criminal offense that could carry prison time. Karen's lawyer tried one last desperate pivot, arguing that his client had acted in good faith because she truly believed the badge was fake. But my wife, ever the professional, dismantled that argument by pointing out that Karen had been given multiple opportunities to verify the badge with the federal agency and had refused every single time, a refusal that, in legal terms, demonstrated willful disregard for the truth. By the time closing statements rolled around, you could feel the tide of the room completely against her. Board members avoided eye contact. Residents murmured quietly in the back, and Karen sat rigid, jaw clenched, as if she could hold her collapsing narrative together by sheer force of will. Judge Palmer didn't even take a recess before issuing his verdict, guilty on all counts related to false reporting. Defamation and obstruction were the side order of court costs and damages that, once tallied, were going to hurt far more than she expected, especially after he approved our civil suit for reputational harm, which would allow us to garnish her wages if necessary. The moment the gavel fell, you could practically hear the oxygen leave Karen's lungs. But the best part was still to come. As she stood there, stunned, my wife rose, crossed the courtroom with the same composed authority she'd shown from day one, leaned just close enough for Karen to hear, and said, "Next time you accuse someone of impersonating an officer, make sure they're not the one who trains them." The gallery erupted in a mix of chuckles and shocked gasps, and as we walked out together, past the same HOA members who had once backed Karen to the hilt, not one of them could meet our eyes. A week later, the HOA quietly removed Karen from any position of influence, citing behavior unbecoming of a community representative. And though she still lived in the neighborhood, she avoided us like the plague, her once daily theatrics replaced by a silence that was almost too good to be true. As for my wife, the whole ordeal ended up being a strange sort of blessing. The viral spread of the courtroom footage, particularly the moment she revealed her badge, earned her widespread respect in the community, gave her a speaking invitation at the local police academy, and, ironically enough, made her the go-to contact for neighborhood security concerns, which meant the HOA now had to go through her if they wanted anything done. Every time I think about it, I can't help but laugh. Karen had set out to humiliate us, to paint my wife as a fraud, and instead she'd handed us the biggest power shift in the history of our little lakeside neighborhood, all because she couldn't resist making one phone call too many.